gentlemen and dear guests, it's both a pleasure and honor for me to be able to welcome you in the name of the state capital Mainz in our city hall. And I'm particularly pleased that Madam Prime Minister Malu Dreyer is our guest here today, emphasizing the importance of your event for our city and for the state of Rhineland-Palatinate through her presence. A very warm welcome to you, Madam Dreyer. My next greetings are, of course, to our conference guests, above all the chairperson of the European Consortium for Political Research, in short ECPR, and professor at the University of Trento, Professor Simona Piattoni. Welcome at night. We are all very pleased about your coming and hope that you and your guests will feel at home in every respect in our city. I welcome further with Professor Manuel Sanchez de Dios, the chief organizer of the joint sessions, which are the very heart of the ECPR, or as you say, the jewel in the crown. Welcome. I welcome in addition the academic ECPR director, Professor Martin Bull, as well as the conference coordinator, Mrs. Marcia Taylor. You're all welcome at the City Hall. Thank you very much for staying here. Dear guests, I'm pleased that the Johannes Gutenberg University, as the host of this year's conference, is so prominently represented. Thus, first of all, I welcome Professor Georg Grausch, the president of the university. Your attendance, Professor Grausch, is a renewed sign for me of the close collaboration between the university and the city, a fruitful cooperation which has not existed just since the national-wide renowned honoring of Mainz as City of Science. Mainz and Mainz University, that is rather a close link that has shaped our academic life, admittedly with interruptions for over 500 years. Welcome, Professor Grausch. I welcome in addition the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, Media and Sport, Professor Stefan Aufenanger, as well as the head of the Department of Political Science, Professor Kai Arzheimer, and with him, of course, the entire organization team of the conference. Welcome to Mainz City Hall. In the next few days, dear guests, a workshop marathon awaits you. Behind that, it's not just an organizational masterpiece. Behind that are above all masses of commitment and work by the workshop leaders. My special tribute thus goes to you, ladies and gentlemen. And, of course, I would also not like to forget the many hundreds of academics who have come to us in Mainz. Without you, ladies and gentlemen, the joint sessions simply wouldn't exist. Last but not least, I welcome particularly warmly the Mainz political scientist, Professor Jürgen Falter, our keynote speaker today, in honor of the great Norwegian sociologist Stein Rokkan. Welcome, Mr. Falter. Ladies and gentlemen, you are perhaps not exactly in a historical venue here in the council chamber of Mainz City Hall, the building designed by the world-famous Danish architect Arne Jacobsen in the 1970s is probably still too recent for that. But you are undoubtedly in a high political venue, because here in the council chamber, the political heart of our city beats. The City Council meets here, the most important receptions and award ceremonies take place here, and of course an Oberbürgermeister, the mayor, is installed in office here. So what place could be better suited for a conference dealing with politics than this house of the citizens, as a house of living democracy. And hardly any other city is better suited as a conference venue than one of Germany's oldest cities, in which history was written more than once in 2000 years. I won't now begin with the ancient Romans, even if our city is full of important relics from precisely this period. I won't speak either about the heyday of Mainz in the Middle Ages and early modern history when German history was actively shaped from here. No, I would like to emphasize a different event, because there, where the Parliament of Rhineland-Palatinate has its home today, in the Deutschhaus, the erstwhile commandery of the Teutonic Order, a parliament convoked in a democratic manner for the first time in German history, met on the 7th of March, 1793. The Mainz Republic took place exactly 220 years ago now. A further great event in the history of Mainz took place over 500 years ago. An event without which modern communication, without which science and research as we know them today, would not be even conceivable. The invention of letterpress printing with movable type by Johannes Gutenberg. I very much recommend you to go and see two of these precious Bibles in the original in the Gutenberg Museum. But why have I picked out these two milestones from the rich history of Mainz? Because both of them are to be seen not only in their historical context, but because they continue to have an influence until today, either through the ideas of liberty, equality and democracy, or through their outstanding importance of our modern communication. In a sense, it is thus about us living together as a society, as a social and political community, as human beings. And thus about questions to which precisely your discipline, dear guests, has been devoting itself today and in the next few days in our city. I wish you great success for this, many interesting discussions and new findings, but above all, a wonderful stay in Mainz. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, dear Lord Mayor Ebling. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to start with a little capture of goodwill with regards to my spoken English, which is neither too well pronounced nor as well structured as it should be, probably. However, I take comfort in a subtle hint. Wolfgang Schäuble, the German Minister of Finance, gave to the former French President Sarkozy, who, some years ago, vehemently refused to address an important international conference in English. The German minister advised Sarkozy at that time that badly spoken English is the most frequently spoken language on the planet, besides Chinese. Following this, Sarkozy changed his mind and delivered his speech in English. I do hope that there are other representatives of this particular working language among you here tonight, so that I don't have to feel too alone. As far as all the others are concerned, I beg your pardon in advance. Dear Chairwoman, Professor Piattoni, dear President of the University, Professor Krausch, dear Professor Falter, and last but not least, distinguished guests and participants of the ECPR conference. Welcome to you all in the name of the government of Rhineland-Palatinate. I would like to say that it gives us great pleasure to welcome you here in the town hall of the city of Mainz. I'm very glad to be here with you tonight, and I'm grateful that I may speak to you all, having come to us from all parts of Europe and even from many countries of our continent, of other countries. Dear Professor Arzheimer, when I received your invitation to give a welcome address here tonight, the following questions came to my mind. What actually is the difference between politics and political science? What are the common features of politics as I experience it, and political science, which is your everyday business? Of course, we all operate in the same field of observation and action, but what actually is politics? Ladies and gentlemen, we political practitioners rather rarely ask this question. For us, the field of politics is our natural playground. Being in the middle of it every day, we are trying to shape political actions and structures, and of course, we are shaped by them. We move within them like a fish in water. We reference to Max Weber, the great German political analyst of the early 20th century. One could say, this is an example of the fact that we often neglect to think out clearly what seems to be obvious because it is intuitively familiar. But Weber's sophisticated explanation doesn't really answer my question. So, it's politics primarily a struggle for power in the state and in international relations? Or is politics primarily an ideological and philosophical competition about the right social or political order? For me, as a student of the law and former state attorney, discussing and designing norms of law is an essential aspect of the political life. On the other hand, when I have a look at the daily news and the comments in the newspapers or on television, the politics primarily seems to be a process of communication. Politics, in a common sense, contains surely something of all of these aspects. We politicians experience this very closely every day. But which of these factors works how? And how do they influence each other? In the hectic rush of the political everyday life, this is not always revealed to us, or not always in a clear-cut fashion. Here, at this point, the concepts and findings of political science are needed. Here you are all called for us as political researchers to create clarity with the means of scientific analysis, critical observation and evaluation, so that we, politicians and average citizens as well, learn to understand what moves the political world and what it is that holds it together. Ladies and gentlemen, politics in modern times, you know this just like me, is shaping almost all spheres of life. It seems a ubiquitous phenomenon. Nevertheless, there are many national and cultural differences being caused by different historical developments and experiences. It is therefore of utmost importance to take a comparative look at the different experiences and interpreters of political topics. This comparison of different political systems and political cultures is hence an important task of the political science. I even would say it is one of its most important tasks today. Dear Professor Piattoni, in the succession of the outstanding Norwegian political scientist Stein Rokkan, the European Consortium of Political Research has done excellent cross-national cooperative work in this field, and this for more than 40 years. Against the background of the European process of integration and in view of an increasing globalization of all areas of life, this work cannot to be appreciated highly enough. The large number of the European members and the associated institutions from overseas makes clear how successful the ECPR has been in moving forward the international cooperation within the political science during the last 4 decades. Of all activities of the ECPR, the joint sessions of workshops is regarded as the crown jewel, it always was said, of this scientific association, and rightly so. With its numerous meetings and working groups covering wide ranges of subjects, these joint sessions offer the opportunity for the participating scientists to exchange thoughts and new ideas, so providing an excellent forum for substantial research discussions. Ladies and gentlemen, looking at the program of the 41st joint sessions of workshops, it is clear that this year, yet again, a great number of highly interesting topics will be covered. If my job left me a little bit more time, then I should most certainly be participating in some of the workshops myself. As the head of the state government, for example, I have great interest in the workshop about decision-making under ambiguity and time constraints. As a leader of a red-green coalition in this federal state, I would choose the topic about green Leviathan, ecological insurance agencies, or capitalism agent. And as a party member and the election campaigner, I should be particularly interested in the topic of the negative campaigning in elections and referenda and its effects on citizens' attitudes and behavior. With regards to the various interesting topics and the numerous political scientists from all around the world attracted by them, I am pleased that the Executive Committee of the ECPR has decided to hold this important European Congress this year with us in Rhineland-Palatinate and at the Johannes Gutenberg University. This is a great honor, not only for the University of Mainz or for the scientific staff of the Department of Political Science, but also for us who are carrying political responsibility in this state. I also greatly appreciate the decision of the Executive Committee to select our state capital, Mainz, as a conference venue, because Rhineland-Palatinate, as a friendly and traditional cosmopolitan state, maintains diverse political, economic, scientific, and cultural contacts with the partner regions in Europe and beyond. Although Rhineland-Palatinate is a relatively young state in the federal structure of Germany, it was established by the French military government after the Second World War. Nevertheless, the region between Rhine and Moselle can look back on a long and eventful political history in the middle of Europe. For over 2,000 years, Rhineland-Palatinate has been at the center of political interests of the European great powers. However, not only German and European history was made here, but furthermore, the cultural developments in the history of political and philosophical thoughts and ideas found influences from Rhineland-Palatinate in the past. Outstanding names that are associated with the area are, for example, Nicholas of Cusa, Johannes Gutenberg, and, for political scientists and economics, more important, of course, Karl Marx. His ideas for more than 1 century were the ideological guiding star for a great number of scientists and politicians. Nevertheless, his concepts were also controversial from the very start. Many critics considered his thesis as absolutely wrong. Whatever one thinks about the Marxist theory, whether it is considered to be out of the date or it is deemed completely wrong in its analysis, with John Stuart Mill, the great liberal English philosopher of the 19th century, one could say that man is capable of rectifying his mistakes by discussion and experiences, not by experience alone. There must be discussion to show how experience is to be interpreted. In this sense, I wish you many vivid discussions with good results in the context of this year's ECPR conference. In particular, I wish you a very interesting and enjoyable lecture by Professor Falter. Thank you very much for listening and very welcome in our state.
Madam President, Mayor, thank you very much for your kind words. We are honored and grateful to be your guests tonight. Without moral and tangible support from you and your respective offices, organizing this conference would not have been possible. That you, dear colleagues, would be here tonight and this week was by no means a foregone conclusion. Everyone in this room knows that these are tough times for the social sciences. But early on in the process, the state government encouraged us to go ahead with our bid, pledging that they would find ways and means to help us get this conference to Mainz. The mayor, too, immediately recognized the caliber of this event and of our potential guests and opened his house for us, inviting us to the very heart of his city. But this is not just about the opening of chambers, cellars, and coffers, important as that may be. It is also about the dialogue between politics and science. Politics and political science do normally occupy separate spheres. In fact, the very name of our profession is quite a misnomer. What we do as a profession is hopefully not a political science, but rather a science of politics. While we might know a thing or two about politics, I suspect that most of us would make lousy politicians. And from Germany's current spate of resignations over plagiarized PhDs, one gets the impression that, as a general rule, politicians do not necessarily make brilliant scientists. And yet, I think we should, as Minister President Dreyer has just suggested, spend more time together. In my humble experience, talking with politicians can be a very useful reality check for us scientists. And hopefully, politicians get something out of this conversation too. In the best of all possible worlds, this would be the insight that the social sciences are simply an excellent way to spend the taxpayers' money, and some more of it should be sent into our general direction. Short of that, I settled for communicating the idea that politics, messy as it is, can be studied through reason and empirical investigation, and is therefore a worthy object of scientific inquiry. So it is very flattering as well as encouraging that the Minister President and the Mayor found the time to attend the Rokkan lecture, even if they might have to leave a little earlier. And I think it is very apt that the lecture is delivered here in this chamber, where, as the Mayor has just reminded us, real politics is made on a daily basis. We need more such exchange. Thank you again for having us here. I hope you will enjoy the presentations and the lecture. Finally, I would like to thank the Executive Committee and its chair, Professor Simona Piattoni, for the trust they put in us, and Central Services for the support they have been giving us over the last couple of years. It has been quite a journey, but my wonderful team and I are enjoying every step of it. I hope you're enjoying your time with us too.
Mayor Ebling, Minister President Dreyer, thank you very much for hosting this ECPR event in Mainz and in the state of Rheinland-Pfalz. You're right, the joint sessions are the flagship event of the ECPR, the oldest and most renowned event, come to its 41st edition this year, gathering some 650 scholars, actually a handful less due to the weather, but never mind. And for 6 days, over a record number of 30 workshops. So really, thank you for your hospitality. But my thanks also go to the president of the Johannes Gutenberg University and to the Department Chair of Political Science, Carla Zeimer, because really they made us felt at home in their rooms and in their halls. And I would say that this is one of the distinguishing features of the joint sessions and of other ECPR events, that we like to be hosted by universities because for a few days we truly feel part of the same community of scholars. And really our heartfelt thanks to both of them for truly making us feel part of the same family. My second task, apart from thanking you all, is simply to introduce the awarders of the various prizes that we award today. And so I will introduce them all in one go, and so then the prize award ceremony can start. First of all, Professor Manuel Sanchez de Dios will award the Wildemann Prize, and as you heard, is also the EC member in charge of the joint sessions, so it will be a particular pleasure. Professor Alexander Segerberg will present the Jean Blondel Prize. And finally, Professor Nilo Kauppi, instead of Professor Jürgensen, who is still trying to get here, will present the Dalder Prize. So after this very short introduction, please the prizes, and thanks again.
The Wildemann Prize is awarded to Jacques Blumenau. He made an outstanding paper titled Agenda Control and Party Cohesion in the European Parliament. He applied the Carton agenda model of Cox and McCammon to the study of the European Parliament with a very good conclusion that the party that takes the median position in the European Parliament tends to be very cohesive and avoid divisive aspects of the legislative agenda.
The ECPR created its PhD prize in 2003, and from 2005 it was named the Jean Blondel Prize. This prize is for the best thesis in politics, broadly conceived to include international relations, political theory, and public administration, and so on. And the prize is awarded to the best thesis nominated by a full member institution and a thesis that, with revision, could potentially be published as a high-quality book within the regular ECPR Press monograph series. It is awarded annually, and the winner receives €1,000. The Jean Blondel PhD Prize for 2012 is jointly awarded to Didier Kaluwertz from the Freie Universität Brussels and Julian Wucherpfennig from the Eidgenössische Technische Hochschule in Zürich. And wasn't it well done? I've been practicing all afternoon. This is the first time, I should say, that the prize is awarded jointly to two authors. The jury wished to recognize the outstanding qualities of both dissertations. The jury consisted of Robert Elgi, Piero Ignazi, and Hans-Peter Krisi, and Peter Keneally acted as chairperson representing ECPR Press. Dr. Kaluwertz wins the prize for a dissertation entitled Confrontation and Communication: Experiments on Deliberative Democracy in Linguistically Divided Belgium. This dissertation asks whether exercises in deliberative democracy in deeply divided societies reduce political conflict. Specifically, it examines whether different institutional rules affect the quality of deliberative democracy. It is also, among other things, based on a highly innovative experimental research design. The jury in this case was particularly impressed with the very careful research design and the clarity of the writing style, which makes the thesis accessible to both a professional and a wider audience. Unfortunately, Dr. Kaluwitz could not make it here due to the adverse weather conditions. Dr. Wucherpfennig wins the prize for a dissertation on fighting for change, onset, duration, and recurrence of ethnic conflict. This dissertation examines the role of ethnicity in civil wars. It proposes a theoretically grounded grievance-based model in which the systematic denial of state benefits on the basis of ethnicity creates a collective demand for political change that can lead to conflict. It submits the model to rigorous empirical testing and finds support for it. The jury in this case was particularly impressed by the way in which Dr. Wucherpfennig identified the potential impact of his findings. In contrast to much of the existing scholarship, which assumes that grievances are constant and ethnic conflict is inevitable, Dr. Wucherpfennig's work suggests that if grievances can be accommodated, then conflict can be avoided. We, of course, extend our warmest congratulations to these two authors, and I'd like to ask Peter Keneally, who did just make it through in these adverse weather conditions, to present the prize to Dr. Wucherpfennig.
The ECPR, in recognition of Hans Daalder, one of the consortium's founding fathers, has instituted the Hans Daalder Prize. The prize is an award of €1,000 for an outstanding paper presented at the ECPR Graduate Student Conference and is awarded biannually. The Hans Daalder Prize 2013 goes to Katrin Scherman and Laurens Enzer Jedenastik, working in the Department of Government at the University of Vienna. Their paper is entitled Linking Party Pledges to Policy Outcomes, the Austrian Case. The committee emphasizes three features. The author's conclusion is clear: certain institutional conditions do increase the likelihood of pledge fulfillment. Moreover, the paper is well designed and laudably focused. Finally, the methodology of the paper is well elaborated, it can be replicated. The prize committee congratulates the prize winners for their great accomplishment.
Dear colleagues, it is my great pleasure to introduce this year's Rokkan lecturer, who in turn introduced me to the work of Stein Rokkan many summers ago. For more than 4 decades, he has published widely in the fields of political methodology, contemporary history, and political sociology. Before coming to Mainz in the 1990s, he held chairs at the University of the Armed Forces in Munich and the Free University of Berlin, and declined office at various other prestigious institutions. His visiting positions include appointments at the Center for European Studies in Harvard, Johns Hopkins University, the University of Minnesota, and the Center for Advanced Studies in Berlin. He has served in too many academic offices to mention them all, including stints as Dean of the Social Science Faculty here in Mainz, long-term member of this university's Academic Senate, and President of the German Political Science Association. While he is perhaps best known for his work on the voters of Hitler's original Nazi party, he has also published a number of articles on the social composition of the party itself after gaining access to what remains of the party's member register. But although this part of his work is certainly impressive, in conversation he often gave the impression that he considered it somehow unfinished. And so I felt very happy for him when last year, after his official retirement, he was appointed senior research professor so that he could return to this project unfettered by teaching obligations and administrative duties. Tonight, he offers us a glimpse into his current work on the social basis of National Socialism. Dear colleagues, I give you Professor Jürgen Falter.
Let me start with a positive message. I am the last obstacle to the reception. And I have a negative message as well. I'm joining the club of imperfect speakers of English. You know all perhaps these jokes of Radio Erivan or Jerivan, where a question is asked and there's an answer given which has not really anything to do with the question. And let me start with a joke like that. Is it true that I will talk for exactly 30 minutes? In principle, yes, but only if you stop all clocks after 29 minutes. No, Mrs. Prime Minister, I will try to be as short as possible, actually. I know about your time restraints. Okay, political cleavages in the Weimar Republic and the rise of National Socialism. The notion of cleavage is at least twofold. We are talking here, don't be disappointed, exclusively about societal cleavages that form party systems. The conception was developed, as you all know, by Seymour Martin Lipset and Stein Rokkan in the 60s. It was immediately acknowledged by the scientific community as a most fertile theory explaining the historical development of most West and some Central European party systems. Of course, you all know this concept by heart. Well, at least almost all of you. Nevertheless, I cannot spare you, some of you know it presumably better than I do, a very, very short description of the concept. Before that, I would like to point out, however, that the alphabet is crudely unjust to Stein Rokkan. Everybody who reads his numerous publications on historical sociology knows that he should be named as the first author of cleavage structures, party systems, and voter alignments, since he did much more research on the historical development of party systems than Seymour Martin Lipset did. Now back to cleavages. The Lipset-Rokkan cleavage concept deals, in the words of its authors, with societal conflicts and their translation into party systems. But what are cleavages? Paraphrasing Gabriel Almond, we can define political cleavages as national, ethnic, linguistic, economical, and religious divisions in a society that affect political allegiances and policies. These cleavages, according to Arthur Stinchcomb, can best be described as lines of tension separating the different coalitions between party elites in specific social groups. Lipset and Rokkan suggest that historically, most West European parties can trace their roots to four primary societal or historical cleavages. These are, and you know them, A, center versus periphery, that's the dominant culture against the subject culture. B, church versus state, that's the power struggle over the role of the church. C, primary economy versus secondary economy, that's the agricultural industrial cleavage. And D, the employers versus workers, the capitalist cleavage in a way, it's the class cleavage. What I will do in the following is to trace the electoral success of the NSDAP during the last years of the Weimar Republic in terms of the Rokkan-Lipset conception of cleavages. My leading question is if the surge of the NSDAP mainly took place within the boundaries of the given cleavage structure, or if the NSDAP was primarily a cleavage overarching movement. I will start with a short look at the party system of the Hohenzollern Empire and its transition to the early Weimar Republic. Then I will look at the stability of cleavage-based voter coalitions before and after 1924. And following this, I will analyze the voter movements within and between cleavage-defined political camps. And finally, I will ask if the NSDAP was indeed a cleavage-transcending party in looking at the social composition of its electorate and party membership. Let me start with political cleavages in the Hohenzollern Empire and the early Weimar Republic. In the German Empire after 1871, these four cleavages clearly manifested themselves in the party system of the time. The church versus mainly the Prussian state cleavage was represented by the Catholic Center Party. The primary versus secondary economy cleavage by the agrarian-based conservative parties on the one hand, and the liberal parties on the other, and the class cleavage by the Social Democratic Party, and the center versus periphery cleavage by national and ethnic minorities such as the Danish Party, the Polish parties, the parliamentarian group of the Alsace-Lorraine deputies, and the Welfen Party, which wanted to restore the old state, the old kingdom of Hanover. After World War I and the defeat of Imperial Germany, which was accompanied by a largely successful political revolution, the governmental and parliamentarian institutions changed, but the cleavage-based party structure survived, at least when we look at political camps or tendencies. This is shown in the next figure, where we compare the strength of parties or party families before and after the war and the revolution of 1919. Because of the cession of territories in the Versailles Treaty to neighboring countries, the center-periphery cleavage more or less vanished. The other three cleavages prevailed, as will be shown in a minute. In 1920 and 24, in the first Reichstag elections of the Weimar Republic, the political camps showed, admittedly with some variation, about the same strength as in the last Reichstag election of the Hohenzollern Empire, that is, the election of 1912. The strongholds of the Center Party and its newly founded, more conservative Bavarian sister party, BVP, that is the predecessor of the Bavarian CSU, were strictly limited to the Catholic regions of Germany, while on the other hand, the by now three socialist parties, the SPD, the USPD, and the KPD, still had their strongholds in the industrial parts of Germany. The two liberal parties had, more than any other party, their strongholds in the cities, while the conservative DNVP was still strongest in the Protestant regions of the Weimar Republic. My colleague and former collaborator, Jürgen Winkler, however, has shown that the apparent stability of political camps was partly a surface phenomenon. Below the national level, some rearrangement of the regional spread of parties could be observed due to institutional changes, such as the introduction of a strict proportional representation system and universal suffrage. The conservatives managed to win additional votes in the cities, while the Social Democrats were able to expand into the Protestant countryside. Furthermore, in comparison to 1912, the two Catholic parties expanded into confessionally mixed regions while losing votes in the overwhelmingly Catholic parts of Germany. On the other hand, the conservatives and the socialist parties were able to gain some ground in Catholic regions. Above all, the conservatives, in comparison to 1912, lost many votes in the Protestant rural parts of Germany, which was, in a way, a necessary precondition of the rise of National Socialism, especially in these regions. Let us stay for a moment at the aggregate or the regional level, where we analyze the social correlates of the major Weimar parties over time. For this reason, I have prepared a huge table with hundreds of correlation coefficients, which nobody could decipher in this hall. Too many coefficients, much too small letters. Therefore, I will not present it. Instead, I will try to give you a short verbal interpretation of the many findings hidden in these correlation coefficients. They were calculated on the basis of the more than 1,000 Weimar counties, townships, and cities. The following results, by the way, are amply confirmed by multiple regression analyses, tree analyses, latent variables, path analyses, and so on. So one can believe them, or trust me. It is evident from our figures that the confessional cleavage remained of major importance for the two Catholic parties until the very end of the Weimar Republic. Reverse voting patterns may be found for the two socialist parties, especially the SPD and for the DNVP, all of which up to the end were rooted in Protestant regions. The second cleavage, which was represented by the share of blue-collar workers, proved to be of lasting importance as well. During the course of the Great Depression, however, a further line of division demarcated by the unemployment rate rose within the blue-collar sector. According to our correlation coefficients and in congruence with the results of much more sophisticated tools of analysis, this new division promoted the growth of the KPD, which more and more became the party of the unemployed. It is a myth that unemployed workers voted NSDAP in disproportionate numbers. Finally, with regard to the third cleavage, based upon the percentage of people employed in the agriculture sector, there was only a relatively minor change as far as most parties were concerned. Only the DNVP seems to have lost its strong social basis in the rural Protestant regions of Germany. This may be interpreted as an indicator of weaker party affiliations in the agrarian Protestant regions. These affiliations weakened even more in the course of the hyperinflation of 1923 and the agrarian crisis of 1927 following. The principal beneficiary of this DNVP decline after 1930 was the NSDAP, whose electoral success in 1932 and 1933 was especially high on average in those areas where the share of the Protestant rural population was high. If the cleavage concept is valid for the Weimar Republic, voter fluctuations between political camps or the cleavage-defined political blocs should be significantly lower or smaller than voter fluctuations within political camps. To check this proposition, I'm becoming statistically a bit more adventurous. By the way, graphically as well, if this works out. The following reconstruction of voter fluctuations is based on estimates obtained by a method known as ecological regression analysis. I can't explain it now, it would take much too long time. It can be explained afterwards during the reception. Table 1A. Table 1A reports the retention or stability rates of the different political camps. It's difficult to decipher, I know. This retention rate is the percentage of those in each political camp who voted in any of two consecutive elections, either for the same party or for another party belonging to the same political bloc. High stability rates are, as pointed out, a prerequisite of cleavage theory. It is no surprise that the socialist and Catholic blocs reflect the highest stability rates. From one election to the next, they managed to retain an average of 2/3 of the voters, which is rather close to what happens nowadays, by the way. In contrast, the bourgeois Protestant voter bloc had a relatively low retention rate after 1924. On average, only about 1/3 of those who belonged to the bourgeois Protestant bloc voted for parties that represented this bloc in consecutive elections. From 1924, there was a clear decline in the retention rate within this bloc, with the second wave of defections between September 1930 and July 1932. Within this group, the retention rates were especially low for the liberal parties and for the various special interest and regional parties. Table 1b displays the complementary phenomenon of shifts from one bloc to the other. The socialist bloc showed the lowest rate of voter movement to another political camp, followed closely by the Catholic bloc. The bourgeois Protestant bloc, on the other hand, from December 1924 to March 1933, showed the by far highest between voter fluctuations of all political blocs. This leads us to the NSDAP. Our ecological regression coefficients indicate that voter shifts between the liberals and the conservatives, as well as other political parties of the bourgeois Protestant camp, on the one hand, and the NSDAP on the other, not only occurred every now and then, but are clear and undeniable. In July 1932, for example, over 40% of the voters who had supported bourgeois Protestant parties in 1930 switched to the NSDAP. Voter movement to the NSDAP, however, was not restricted to the supporters of the bourgeois Protestant camp. There were also significant voter shifts between the other political blocs and the NSDAP after 1928. Table 1c reveals the absolute contributions of the individual political camps to the electoral surge of the NSDAP as net percentages. In looking at all consecutive elections in the Weimar Republic, that's the last column of Table 1c, it becomes clear that non-voters contributed by far the largest share of votes flowing to the Hitler movement, with almost 14% of the National Socialist vote coming from this source. Former voters for the various special interest and regional parties in the bourgeois Protestant bloc were another particularly important source of Nazi electoral support. More surprising, however, is the fact that net voter fluctuations from the socialist bloc to the NSDAP was virtually as high in absolute numbers or absolute percentages as that from the two liberal parties or the DNVP. Of course, this has to be attributed to the fact that the KPD and SPD together attracted many more voters than the two Catholic parties, the two liberal parties, or the nationalists. As we know from other research, it were primarily former SPD voters who migrated from the socialist bloc to the NSDAP after 1928. The KPD electorate, in contrast, proved to be more or less immune against the National Socialist contagion. By far the smallest net voter fluctuations to the NSDAP, however, were manifested by the Catholic bloc. The above-mentioned asymmetries of voter change notwithstanding, more than any other party, the NSDAP was able to attract voters from different political camps. Being able to bridge the political clefts of the Weimar Republic was a prerequisite for the enormous electoral success of the National Socialists. My next question is, was the NSDAP a cleavage transcending party? I would like to address, in other words, the question to what extent the NSDAP was able to overarch the social conflict lines of the Weimar Republic. Or in other words, I would like to find out if the NSDAP was a mainly socially homogeneous or a mostly heterogeneous party. Or to phrase it still differently, was the NSDAP indeed predominantly a middle-class movement, as stipulated by Seymour Martin Lipset and many others, or was it more of a catch-all party of protest? Again, I will rely on results of various ecological regression analyses. Table 2 depicts the results of such an analysis for the last 5 Reichstag elections of the Weimar Republic. The starting point is the Reichstag election of 1928, which may be regarded as the last normal election before the Great Depression and the subsequent rise of National Socialism. In July 1932, In this Reichstag election, the NSDAP managed to win the highest share of the popular vote in a truly free election, some 38% of the valid vote. The March 1933 election, which took place after Adolf Hitler became appointed Reich Chancellor, is to be characterized as only half free, but still, the voters had a chance to opt for all parties on the ballot, and there were still all parties on this ballot. Our results indicate, with regard to the social background of the NSDAP voters, a much less distinct composition of the Nazi electorate than is implied by most varieties of the middle-class hypothesis. Only in regard to religious denomination are there some really clear-cut differences of affinity towards the NSDAP. As Table 2 shows, in July 1932, only 1 out of 7 eligible Catholics, that is 16%, opted for National Socialism. But almost 40% of the non-Catholic voting body seem to have voted NSDAP. During the last half-free election of March 1933, this Catholic resistance started to weaken slightly. But even then, the relative affinity of non-Catholics to the National Socialism was almost double that of the Catholics. If you look at the number of votes cast by the Catholic Center Party, there's great overall stability. Only its Bavarian counterpart, the Bavarian People's Party, in comparison with 1930 and 1932, lost a few 100,000 voters. It is utterly improbable that Adolf Hitler would have come to power in January 1933 with only 16% of the electorate behind him. This is the share of the vote he might have got in July 1932 had all of Germany been Catholic and the patterns of voting behavior the same overall. How strong was the class cleavage in binding workers? That's the next question I'm going to ask. The middle class hypothesis, which for quite a long time used to be the leading hypothesis on the Nazi electorate, claims a strong disparity of voting preferences to Nazism between working class and middle class voters. Our ecological regression estimates indeed show a somewhat lesser affinity of working class voters to the NSDAP, but differences between the social strata are much smaller than should be expected from the perspective of the middle class hypothesis. In 1932 and 1933, according to our findings, not only blue-collar, but also white-collar workers showed a below-average sympathy for National Socialism at the polls, although the difference between the social categories is far from overwhelming. The only social layer with a strong upward deviation from the average NSDAP vote seems to have been the old Protestant middle class, that is, independent businessmen, artisans, and farmers. At least in respect to this group, Lipset seems to have been correct in his claim of the NSDAP being a movement of middle-class extremism. Taken together, the two middle strata embrace about 60% of the Nazi constituency, a proportion which remains remarkably stable up to 1933. Working-class voters, on the other hand, consistently represented up to 40% of the electorate. This margin appears much too high to speak any longer of the NSDAP as a pure or at least clearly prevalent middle-class movement. On the contrary, our figures seem to support quite forcefully a catch-all conception of Nazism. Having considered all this, the results of our findings so far show the NSDAP emerging as a party which drew support at the polls from different political backgrounds and different social strata, and was, with the two notable exceptions of religious denomination and the unemployed industrial proletariat, more equally distributed among the different social and demographic categories than any other major party of the Weimar Republic. Let me underline this a little bit. with a look at the social composition of the NSDAP party members. The same broad social spectrum of support for the NSDAP can be found with regard to its members. You should be aware that we are now dealing exclusively with real individual data. That is, in contrast to voting data, we do not have to infer from the aggregate to the individual level, an operation which is always somehow risky. The following empirical results are based on the largest sample drawn so far from the NSDAP master file with its more than 11 million membership cards, which miraculously survived World War II almost undamaged. As figure 4a shows, about 40% of new entrants into the NSDAP in the years 1925 to 1933 were laborers. About a third were self-employed, and a fifth named as their profession white-collar workers. Since only 6 to 7% of the new party members were women, it may be wise to differentiate between male and female new party members, as is done in figure 4b. It is evident that this differentiation does not change the overall result. A major part of the new party members described themselves as either plainly as being a worker or more typically indicated specific blue-collar occupations such as lathe operator or blacksmith and so on. Figure 5 finally categorizes the working class recruits, by the way, it's the last figure I'm showing, categorizes the working class recruits of the Nazi Party according to the economic sector, just to find out if it were typical or atypical blue-collar workers, for example. Again, the party composition was quite evenly spread over the economic sectors, as was the case with the NSDAP electorate. Let me sum up. There's some strong evidence that the NSDAP was a party which managed to a surprising extent, even before its seizure of power and the establishment of the Third Reich, to mold its socially fragmented followers in a numerically strong Volksgemeinschaft type of movement, an achievement which certainly did not make the appointment of Adolf Hitler to Reich Chancellor in January 1933 inevitable, but at least made it conceivable. It should be clear by now that simple explanations of the electoral rise of the NSDAP, such as a common variance of the middle-class hypothesis, are thoroughly inadequate to grasp this phenomenon in all its complexity. And it's inadequate in regard to membership as well. And we are here on very safe grounds. According to our findings, we may interpret the surge of the NSDAP, both at the polls and in regard to its membership, as a combination of middle-class extremism and working-class protest. This mixture was amalgamated by many different factors, some more or less unique to German history, such as an exceptionally fragmented political culture, a particularly splintered party system, and the absence of democratic consensus among political elites, but also by other factors common to most Western nations at the time, such as the impact of the Great Depression. Germany wasn't the only country hit by the Great Depression. There were others, Sweden, Austria, the United States, who had the same impact of the Great Depression. Furthermore, the effects of unemployment and the agrarian crisis, which was a world agrarian crisis as well. These factors, plus the organizational and propagandistic ability of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels, helped to bring the Weimar Republic to an end and paved the way for a most inhuman totalitarian regime. The cleavage structure of the Weimar Republic proved to be, at least in principle, stable in respect to religious denomination and the mobilization of the industrial proletariat, especially the unemployed blue-collar workers by the KPD. In other respects, it proved to be quite permeable, in clear contradistinction to most other parties of the Weimar Republic. The NSDAP managed to bridge, at least to some extent, the political rifts and social class lines, the cleavages of German society. This was undoubtedly a precondition for the Nazi seizure of power. Not a sufficient one, but certainly a necessary condition. As you see, there's no need to stop your clocks. Thank you very much for your interest, and Mrs. Prime Minister for your patience.